So, Mr. Curtis, tell me a little bit about yourself and why you decided to get into this race.
Yeah, so for people who don't know me, I'm best known for running a website called FARC, which is a news aggregator. It's what if The Daily Show ran the Drudge Report. It's been around 17 years, which almost predates almost all digital media. And we have 8 employees. That's a distributed virtualized company, so there's no workplace, and everybody lives wherever they happen to live, San Francisco or Indianapolis or wherever. And then I live here, servers are based here, company's based here. I own 100% of it, which is unusual in tech circles. Usually at some point somebody's gotten venture capital at some stage, and I never did. Mostly because by the time I got to the point where I could get it, I didn't need it. And so it's a fully bootstrapped, digital company. And the best way to explain it for people who have not heard of it, how far into the national zeitgeist it is, it's been a category on Jeopardy twice. And once during the Tournament of Champions. And I recommend if you go on YouTube, you can find at least one of those videos, and it's great because the contestants were completely confused by what was being talked about.
So what made you want to run for governor of Kentucky?
Yeah, so initially it came, in my line of work, it mostly involves reading every news article that's printed every single day. So I sort of more or less have an idea of what's going on. And I'm not a very political person, was not really interested in politics for all of the reasons that people who are not interested in politics are not interested. But I was complaining about sort of the lack of quality candidates and the fact, why wouldn't, qualified people step up and try to get the job? Because this is more like being a CEO, yet somehow we have to, have an election process that's more or less the way that, the high school elections work, where, it's the football guy or it's the cheerleader or whatever, and they're just playing their networks to get elected to. Granted, in high school, it's not that big of a job, but government is arguably one of the more important things in our lives, and for some reason, we've got a very primitive way of selecting candidates. And so I was saying, well, people who are qualified should run. And I got challenged. And they said, well, you should run. And I was like, well, I don't want to. I said, why not? And I was like, well, because it's hard. Who wants to go through all that? And they're like, yeah, but here's the deal. It's like, you like talking to new people. You've done a lot of media interviews. So you know what that's all about. You have good ideas. So, if you're complaining about not having a good candidate to choose from and you're not willing to run, then you have no right to complain. And I thought, okay, that's fine. I should probably do this. And on top of that, I had a friend of mine who had a similar situation. She ran for a judgeship. She was an attorney, didn't particularly like the judge, thought that the judge did a bad job, so she put her hat in the ring and she won. And this was last year. And I was like, okay. That's exactly what I'd been talking about, doing. And so it was like, that's when we started to put together the resources to figure out, how does this work? How do we make sure that we can make a run that, actually has a chance of winning?
Now, to talk about some issues, workforce is something you've talked about in your campaign. You said that obviously having a well-trained workforce is number one to attracting businesses to the state. But right now our workforce system in the state is really disorganized. It's hard for people to navigate, and a lot of people are not happy with the outcomes it's producing. And that was one of the findings in the Kentucky Chamber's new workforce report. And in that report, we also call for the next governor to do a top-to-bottom review of the workforce system in the state. What is your feeling about that review, and how would you conduct it if you were to become governor?
Yeah, before I answer that question, let me tell you, unlike most other candidates, if I forget to answer the second part of a 2-part question, that's because I forgot it. So if you don't mind reminding me, I'm not trying to dodge it, I just will forget it in some narrative.
I will remind you.
On the first point about the workforce, I've seen so many things. I've seen the coal industry claiming that low energy prices are what bring businesses here. And I've seen right to work supporters say that's if we pass this, that'll be what brings people here and we're not competitive. And then economic incentives mattering a whole lot more. Well, a good friend of mine, Greg Cook, who owns Stone Brewing Company, recently did a major expansion. He looked across the entire eastern half of the United States for some place to essentially double his U.S. capacity in. He eventually picked Richmond, and when I asked him about how that all went down, he told me that it really had more to do with, in his case, having to produce a lot of stuff that's going to be sold on the East Coast. Transportation networks were vital. Trained workforce was absolutely vital, but in his case, there were other things like he needed a particular type of water. And then a 60-acre campus that was affordable somewhere near all of this. So it turns out that decisions to move large manufacturing facilities are not made in an absolute vacuum where they're just running numbers like some kind of an economics experiment. In case in point, so like if energy costs, unions, and any of these other things that supposedly bring business were actually the prime drivers, there would be no businesses in California. but there are. And the reason why they're in California is because of trained workforce. If you wanted to set up a tech company that had a reasonable chance of succeeding in Silicon Valley, you've got the banks that know how to do it, the founders that have done it before, a trained workforce and all of that. And the rest of it, even the fact that the Bay Area is an excruciatingly expensive place to live does not stop people from starting companies there. And so it is absolutely the case that a trained workforce is the #1 primary reason why they've moved there. And as Greg told me with his expansion, he was like, if the trained workforce for what he needed to do did not exist, there is no incentive that you could offer that would get him to drop a company in. So it matters a lot. So I've been looking around trying to figure out, so of course the question would be, how do you do this? And I've seen a couple of things I like, and I'm still collecting more. One of them is the KY Fame program that the mayors of Louisville and Lexington started and expanded to about 22 counties now, which is essentially, they had the problem of advanced manufacturing is actually the biggest expanding market we have right now. And in fact, as a percentage of GDP, most people don't realize that our biggest export sector is actually aerospace technology. And that came out of nowhere recently too, actually, and just in the last few years. And it's expanding like crazy. So clearly we want to keep on doing that because advanced manufacturing is going to be the manufacturing of the future. So their solution was, so part of the problem is trained workforce. How do you do that? Well, somebody has to train them. Seems to make sense. Who could do that? So they contacted the community colleges and they said, they contacted community colleges, manufacturers, and basically asked the question to the manufacturers, what skill sets do you need? And then they went to the community colleges and they say, can you teach this? If not, how can we connect you with the resources to be able to do this? And this is a program that funds itself and it's already working in 22 counties. And so it seems to me the obvious step would be to expand this to the entire rest of the state because the trained workforce matters. Along those lines also, I've been working very closely with a lot of tech incubators have realized that they can make some reasonable income off of doing basic training for technology services. So for example, I have friends that run Awesome Inc. in Lexington, and I took from them a course in Xcode, which is what you write iPhone apps on, because I'm a programmer. I code over a dozen languages, but not Xcode. And I kind of wanted to learn it because, not that I'm going to build apps. I mean, we need an app for my company, but I'm not necessarily the one who's going to build it. But so I took a day-long instructional class from them with 2 of my developers that work for me, and it was amazing. And I walked out of there and I could write apps. And it turns out that if you understand sort of basic coding procedures, picking up new languages like this is not all that difficult. But the problem that you've got is that, if you're not involved in software, you probably don't know this, but that the new languages that people use pop up and disappear on a 5-year cycle. So if you're a university, your problem is, well, how do you decide what to teach? Because even if you knew the day that a new computer language becomes the thing we're all going to jump to, even if you knew, and usually we don't, as a university, you then have to find somebody, first of all, identify this as the thing we want to teach, find somebody who's qualified to teach it, develop curriculum, and implement all of this in time for the next thing to completely wash this first thing out. And so in particular, the Awesome Inc. guys are working with the college system in the state to try to see if they can provide an augmentation for that, which is basically, you guys teach all the theory in computer science, and then we will then catch these people right as they come out, and then we'll implement okay, now you know how to code, now here's Xcode, now here's Ruby on Rails, now here's PHP, here's Perl, here's whatever you need. Because they can move quicker, and it doesn't replace anything universities currently do, it augments them. The reason why this matters is because computer programmers are in high demand. In fact, I was talking to Nick over there, and he says that there's at least 5,000 unfilled programming jobs right now, and these are high-dollar jobs. I mean, we're talking easily upper 5, lower 6 figures, depending on where you're at. And to be able to train somebody who doesn't know how to code currently to be able to code, it's not necessarily something everybody can do, but if you could do it, that could substantially improve not only your life, but the lives of your children and your grandkids, and then ends up having a net direct benefit of revenue to the state that pays for itself within about 5 years. And so programs like these are the things that we need to work on expanding for all of the reasons I just laid out.
And I'll get back to technology in a second. Yeah. But back to the workforce report from the Kentucky Chamber.
Yes, that's right. Thank you.
We did call for the next governor to do a complete review, including bringing in an outside entity to kind of look over everything before cabinet structure is even finalized. Because there's a lot of money spent on workforce programs in the state, and businesses are not completely happy with what's coming out. So how would you conduct that type of audit? Yeah,
so there's 2 ways that to do it, because interestingly, I'd been thinking along the same lines, but I've got a couple of tweaks to the idea. One is that it's a good idea to sort of independent third party, yes, no doubt. Then you want to go through to find out where the inefficiencies exist. Is there overlapping? And there is in many cases. Friends of mine who, for example, like own brewing companies, talk about the licensing process and having to go through 20 different organizations. If you could, I have a friend of mine who's willing to build a tool actually, which would sort of adjust. It's like, so you want to do what? And his initial idea was file to run for governor. Okay, well then the tool goes and basically assembles, okay, steps 1 through 20. It goes into the system, it catalogs what needs to be done, and it just builds it up for you. And he said, that's not too hard to build. I know how to code, he's right. Mm-hmm. So that would be a good step. As far as the review of state employees, I would like to offer an additional suggestion to it, which is, so I got an MBA recently in 2011 and 2012 because apparently I hate spare time. And one of the classes that was taught that I sat in on a few of them because it got really interesting was called Turnarounds, which is the science of going into a company that has failed and turning it around. Mm-hmm. It was taught by a guy named Peter Goodson, who incidentally was one of the people who brokered the initial deal at Lexmark in the 1990s, so he's familiar with the area. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that they did, which I thought was particularly intriguing, is that top-down review is a good idea. You must also do a bottom-up. And the reason why is a lot of the inefficiency actually exists at the administrative level. And so it turns out that if you ask the rank and file employees to review their administrators, oftentimes you can find the ones that are completely useless. There are not a lot of false positives that pop out of this. I mean, somebody might not like someone, but generally speaking, the ones that are not effective are fairly obvious in a review like this. And so I would go both directions on that. I would also start on a subset of state government first, just in case, because tackling the entire thing at once is going to be a monster task. Mm-hmm. And things will be learned by doing it on a small scale first. So I would start with maybe a very small branch of government, implement those ideas, figure out what we learned, and then say, okay, do we think we can scale this? Or if we can't, if we can scale it, good, let's do it. If we cannot scale it, well, so then in order, what are the top 5 branches we probably had to take a look at, and so we can get the maximum amount of good done within the least amount of time. So those are the things I would add to that.
Okay, and back on technology,
yes.
On your campaign site, when you talk about jobs, you talked about technology quite a bit, and you even mentioned Eastern Kentucky and said technology could be a way to kind of revamp that region. Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit about what you mean there and how we bring technology jobs or just let it help Eastern Kentucky.
Yeah, so my first experience with this was I went to the SOAR conference this spring. Mm-hmm. And it was fascinating to me because I was born and raised in Central Kentucky, and I've lived here all my life. And my dad worked for the Public Defender's Office and traveled around a bit. So they had 15 branch offices, and I've been to all of those places in the state multiple times. And growing up, it didn't seem like there was a lot of interest in that kind of thing. You know, people were just kind of doing the thing they were doing, and nobody cared. I go to Pikeville, though, in the spring, and lo and behold, everybody's talking about broadband and technology, and we got to learn how to code and all these things. And I was like, wow, everybody's ready for this. Like, this is game on. So that was really interesting because that would mean that if you have a technology-minded governor like myself, that means you don't have to make the pitch, hey, you guys need this. They know, they got it. So then the question is, well, then, so how do you do that? How do you encourage that? So there's a model that I'm aware of that isn't a government model purely, but there's a guy named Brad Feld who founded a company called Techstars, similar to Y Combinator. And Brad is a business acquaintance of mine, and he, in the late 90s, cashed out a .com company somewhere and then moved to Boulder, Colorado because he wanted to. Today, Boulder, Colorado is a tech hub. And the reason why isn't just because Brad Feld moved there. That helped. But one of the things he did was he worked with the local government and the local university system and basically said, and then gathered up some more local investors and said, how can we all make sure this happens? Because it requires the input of all 3 types of people. You need to have the business sector, you need the university, you need government involved. And not one single one of those can pull it off themselves. And so the reason why I find that intriguing is because I've been to Boulder, Colorado a few times, and it's really similar to Pikeville. It's a mountain town, and people who are outdoorsy types. It turns out computer programmers also are avid outdoorsmen for some reason. I'm not sure why that is, but and so the way you attract a class of coders is you make a place that they want to live first and foremost, and then they start showing up. And if it can be done in Boulder, Colorado, people don't remember that 20 years ago Boulder, Colorado was known for Mork and Mindy, and that's about it. But today it's a thriving tech hub like Austin. And that was how they did it, basically, because coders want to live at the places that are good to live in. And having been to Pikeville for the first time in 5 years recently, I can say I was impressed, really impressed. That's a place that I could actually live. And so we've got a really good base here. I think that's how we start.
Perfect. Now on some education issues, you also mentioned early college high school. What exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, so that's the Gatton Academy down in Bowling Green, Kentucky. I actually went through the summer program that was the offshoot, the Vampy camp, in the 80s. And basically what they did was that's a 3-week camp where you end up spending on campus in a dorm, but taking in some cases college level courses. The Gatton Academy was the extension of that, that's a 2-year program, and essentially you are living on campus like the camp I attended, but it's for 2 years. And the courses that they take at the Gatton Academy are college level courses. So what's neat about that is that the first time I came across this, I was invited to speak at a gifted education seminar about 10 years ago. It was down at Shakertown, I think. And they had 5 kids. This was a relatively new program. And so I got a chance to ask some questions because I was kind of curious. One of the fascinating things about these kids is they all had double and triple majors, which is of supreme importance because it turns out that if you're looking for a job that makes the most money, it lies at the intersection of 2 disciplines, usually. And sometimes you can throw a third one in there and you might be the only person in the world that can. So like archaeology, computer science, and economics, for example, have some very rare sort of intersections that you can accomplish a lot with if you know the right people. In particular, one of the kids at that was math, computer science, and psychology. And I was like, you need to get to Wall Street right now because you could design high-speed trading algorithms. Because Wall Street's realized that psychology is a big component of economics, something that they didn't necessarily realize about 10 years ago. So, and I talked to these kids, and my question to them was, the main one was like, do you feel like you had a reduced social experience than your classmates because these people, like, they went from their high schools wherever they were, and they went to live down in Bowling Green on campus at WKU. And I said, do you feel like you missed out? And they're like, we don't understand the question. And I talked to them afterwards about it, and they said, no, we don't. It said, in fact, like, we feel like we had a better experience based on, because like a bunch of them attended UK together. Of the 5 there, I think 3 were getting ready to start classes in the fall, and they were already talking about, but they'd already been in college for 2 years. So if anything, they were actually farther advanced on the social scale than other people were. So I really like this, the idea, because that allows, like, if you've got kids that are capable of handling that kind of a workload, you can throw them into that kind of a system and produce people who have very rarefied, very high-tech skills.
Now, along the same sort of lines, the Chamber has pushed for charter schools, which would obviously help teachers be more innovative. It would help some low-income areas. It really just depends on what legislation is pushed.
Right.
What is your feeling on charter schools?
Yeah, and so you actually sort of hit the nail on the head there. It depends on what legislation is pushed, and it kind of does. Like, for somebody who's not of politics, the policy questions aggravate me the most. Not your question, but the reason why is because, like, how do you feel about charter schools? And I'm like, well, which implementation are we talking about? I think what California did doesn't seem to work very well. So it's really, for me, it's going to come down to what is the implementation. So in particular, we started digging into this, and it looks like the research indicates that it does help lower income places a lot. So for example, West Louisville is clamoring for these things. I would take an implementation that has been tried possibly in like DC, New York, St. Louis that already exists and works, and then copy it or bring the people who are in charge of that out to Louisville as an expansion, for example, and then see how it goes. Rather than instituting a blanket edict going, okay, it's game on for whatever, it's like, let's try a small scale first. Let's have a couple of these things. You guys take a shot at it, and then we'll see how it goes. And if it works, then we'll look at expanding it. Let's be very methodical and conservative about this.
Which is what was pushed for in 2015. The bill actually would set up pilot projects for public charter schools in Jefferson County and Fayette.
Yeah.
So that's
I would be in favor of that.
Okay.
And that's what I mean. It's like, so that's why it depends. Like, are we going to copy California? Nah, that's not a good idea. But that seems okay to me. It's like, or along the same lines, not to change the subject, just to make sure I'm not doing that. The fact that Warren County and passed right to work, and I think Fayette County is looking at it, or they might have passed it. I go ahead. I personally don't think right to work is an effective method of creating jobs, but I don't mind if a couple of cities want to take a shot at it. Go ahead. Let's see what happens. Because if it works, you've just proven me wrong, and now I know that I need to change my stance on it. It's all about, does this work or not? You want to try it in your own area? Have at it. Go for it.
We already stole one of my questions for later, but we'll come back to right to work. But on another education issue, Common Core.
Yes.
In this race, Matt Bevin has said that he is not in favor of the standards. He said he doesn't think they're working the way they were supposed to, and he would like to get rid of them. Jack Conway says that he thinks we should stay the course, but he's open to some changes. Have you looked into that issue at all, Common Core? And I mean, it has been proven to show that we do have more college and career ready students, and we are making some strides. So would you repeal Common Core at this point?
I would not. I have friends who are teachers who also don't like it, but I wouldn't say it's like the majority. I know that somebody did a study where it said most teachers are in favor of it at this point. I would trust the teachers. I mean, if what they want to do, what they think they can implement, that would be the way to go. But I have a friend, I mean, again, it was like we had a rally a week ago, and one of my friends who's a teacher, he hates Common Core. But what he really hates about it, I don't think necessarily is the implementation. It sounds like it's more like the reporting requirements. Mm-hmm. It's the number of things that he has to do in order to be able to teach it. It sounds like it's the equivalent of that office kitchen that everybody's got. And if you're really unlucky, you've got one of those people that writes a sign for everything. Like your mom doesn't work here, clean up, and then put the towels back here, whatever. And so then you go into the kitchen and there's like 20 signs all over the place. And I get the impression that that is what teaching Common Core is like for them. So it isn't necessarily the way that it is, the concept, it's the implementation again, it's the problem. Mm-hmm. My solution there has been, starting with, I've never understood why we are so reluctant to throw regulation on business. Well, actually, I know why that is. But we don't seem to have any trouble throwing them on teachers. And shouldn't that also stop teachers from being able to function as teachers in the same way that it stops business from being able to do a good job as well? So, my thing is to go through and talk to them about, starting with, do you have a reporting requirement you don't like, or that you're pretty sure nobody's looking at? Can we get rid of that? Is there a better way to, fund schools other than who showed up today? Because you have so many snow days because of that's the way we fund schools. They can't stay open if more than 15% of the student body is not going to show up. I find that in particular interesting, not to get off on too much of a tangent, because that's a really complicated, wieldy system to fund schools that clearly replaced something else that wasn't working before. I really kind of curious to find out what that was. Mostly because is the thing it replaced before, was that long enough ago to where we now have a technological solution for it? Was the problem people were lying about attendance? Well, we can check that now. With ways other than, you pen and paper and having to have people show up. So I'm looking for solutions like that, basically.
So more at the local level.
Right, exactly. Well, and so in very specific ones too, it's like, you could be for or against Common Core and that excites people politically. But what I like is when I talk to teachers and I say, give me things that don't work for you. And one of them told me, she said, well, so my pay is based on whether or not my students do well. She said, first of all, can't we at least put some of the blame on textbook companies? I'm like, yeah, this seems reasonable. Implementation to be decided upon later, we'll find out, but I thought that was interesting. But the second thing that she said the other problem is they have 3 major tests that they get evaluated on, and the third one matters the most. Mm-hmm. The problem is the third one, they don't get the results back until after school is out and these kids are gone. So this doesn't help them become better teachers at all, and it's weighted higher. And I said, what would you recommend? And she said, could you make the second test count more? So I'm pretty sure if you throw that to the legislature, they'll be like, yeah, okay. And there's 1,000 more things like this. And so I'm trying to collect a list of these things to basically just sort of like, let's not assume as people who run government that we know how to run education just because we went to school.
Okay, now let's tick through some competitiveness issues.
Sure.
Public-private partnerships.
Yes.
Legislation that has been pushed would really just set up a framework so that things are kind of set in stone. Right now, there's not really a good system for it. How do you feel about public-private partnerships?
I'm fine with that. I am very skeptical about the actual specific deals, however. And I'll put it to you like this. So as I understand it, the bridge between Louisville and Indiana, Indiana paid for their side of it with a PPP. So my question really is like, I have not examined the deal structure because it's Indiana. Whatever they did is whatever they did. But if you have a hedge fund or a financial company looking to invest in that, that automatically tells us that's a good deal. So, if the state had the capacity to take that deal also on the same terms, it probably should, right? So that would be how I'd at least evaluate the deal anyhow, is like if private guys would jump on it 2 seconds, maybe we could make this a little more competitive. Maybe we could bid this out. Like say, hey, we got a $3 billion public-private partnership that wants to bid on this bridge. Anybody else? Because we're gonna have to do this, and also in such a way that it's structured so that it doesn't harm the people who have to use the thing, it harms them as least as possible. It does the least amount of damage. So for example, like with bridges, you've got tolling, which is probably, because if they can't make money off it, I'm pretty sure the Indiana deal is not let's hang KFC ads off the side of it and we'll make all our money, or we'll name it the Colonel Sanders Memorial Bridge. That would be a great deal, by the way. But the upshot is that we have to take a look at the deal structure also and make sure, like, is this a good deal? Like, did we get a good return on their investment, basically. Like, does this work for us in the best way? So I would scrutinize the heck out of those and make them open bidding. But other than that, again, each deal is different, but I'm not opposed to it.
Well, and like you said, tolling is what's holding it up at this point because of the Brent Spence Bridge in northern Kentucky. So, are you open to tolling? Really, the problem that northern Kentuckians say is they go to work in Cincinnati. So they're the ones bearing the burden, and that's why we're having such a problem at this point. So how do you feel about that in general, the tolling of that bridge?
Yeah, so I keep, one of the things that I've run into on this campaign so far is libertarians love me. And I keep having to tell them I'm not libertarian. I mean, I'm close, probably. But here's where it ends, is basically like, I like no taxes, but we got to have bridges and roads and schools and these things. And so you can't have no taxes and infrastructure. So there has to be some way to pay for this one way or the other. It would be nice if the federal government would kick in the entire amount, but let's assume they won't do that.
They're not going to.
If they don't, then the only possible way to get this built is with tolls. There just isn't, the money's not sitting around in an account we haven't tapped yet. I mean, it's just not there. So if that's the case, and if the actual problem then is, okay, so you don't want to soak the locals for that much, if possible. You want to try to make sure that the people who use it all the time are the ones that get the break. So I came up with a unique technological idea for this that I think might work depending. One of the ideas floated was it was like locals pay $1 and non-locals pay $2. Well, okay, so then the question is, well, how do you decide, right? Well, what if I live in Lexington and I work in Dayton and I'm going across that bridge twice a day? Like, how do we make sure, like, that would technically count as local-ish. I mean, they use it all the time. So the idea is based on a couple of different tolling systems I've seen used in different states. So we all are familiar with the transponder version, which is what Chicago and New York use, where you've got a transponder and you roll through on a fast tolling lane, detects the transponder, deducts out of your account, on you go. So that's one way to do it. Denver recently built a beltway around the outside of their city in order to get to the airport, which was built almost in Kansas, I think. Not really, but it was so far out there that it's hard to believe Denver is even actually a part of this area. And they built a giant beltway around it, and they put a toll on it with a transponder, and nobody used it because nobody lived there. And it was like, I'm not going to pay money for that. I can drive on the free road, so they did. So in order to get people to use it, they did an interesting thing. They got rid of the transponders. And so now, if you jump on that toll road, they use high-speed cameras to photograph your license plate. So now you don't need a transponder, which was the only thing they needed to get me to use it. Because I don't live in Colorado. I don't have a transponder, but if I can just jump on this thing and get a photograph of my license plate, fantastic. So now we're talking. And so the idea is basically this. That's how you can let people opt in or opt out to differentiate, are you local or not? Are you local? Buy a transponder, it's $1. Everybody else, photograph the license plate, $5. The reason why is because you can hit semi-tractor trailer traffic that's going across multiple states that way. And they could drive around. We're not forcing you to go across, but that gives locals the option to go, okay, you know what? I don't want to pay $5 every time I go across this thing. And I'm not set in stone on these numbers, by the way, but the upshot is that's a way you could do pricing to allow locals to have a cheaper option than anybody else. Interestingly, also on the tolling, it turns out that I believe in the Kentucky's Constitution it says that if a toll road pays for itself, you must remove the tolls. And I think that is one of the major concerns about this is are they just going to leave it up? Because Ohio might. I don't know that they have that in their Constitution, but we can't. So good news, like, when I was a kid, early 1980s, tolls came off of the parkway right around the corner from my house, and it was because it had paid for itself. So we don't have to worry about that eventuality. The other idea I had is that it was from LA. LA has, they have flex pricing for carpool lanes. Because for whatever reason, no matter how bad the traffic gets in LA, nobody will carpool, and they have these carpool lanes that nobody's in. So in order to make use of this, they decided to put flex pricing on it. So during rush hour, it goes up and down based on how many people are in it already. So for example, the first time I noticed this, I landed in LAX, I was driving due east to Palm Springs. It's an absolute parking lot on, I think it's the 110. And then nobody's in the carpool lane, or there's a few people, but you see the flex price at the end, it says $6. So it's like, basically, are you driving by yourself? Would you like to get in the toll lane right now? Go ahead. Totally optional. We're not going to force you, but if you don't want to sit in this parking lot, jump in. And it flexes up or down based on, so if too many people take $6, it goes to $7. And then it goes to 8, 9, whatever. And then in the middle of the night, it's 0. And so I would also put flex tolling on there as well, so that way if, it's a way to get the bridge paid off faster by people who volunteer the money. And that's how I would do it, because, nobody likes tolls, but if that is the only avenue left available to us, then we're going to have to do it.
Okay, another issue that has to do with projects and removing a certain amount of money once it's done, local option sales tax.
Yes.
local communities sometimes want to build a project in their area, and they could have the option to raise their own sales tax. The voters would vote on whatever project it is and decide whether they want to raise it by a small amount, and then it would go away once the project is completed. Are you in favor of that type of legislation?
For one-offs, yes. For permanent, no.
Okay.
Mostly because, again, it's like, you should be able to explain what the one-offs are, which I assume they would be able to do. So I don't have a problem with that, provided that it makes sense to them. And if the local community decides they want to pay more tax for a local thing, they should be able to do it.
Okay. And then minimum wage. You have said you're in favor of raising the minimum wage.
Yes.
But
and I know you guys aren't big fans of that around here.
But you want to exempt small businesses. So that is interesting. What is your definition of a small business?
Right. So the government defines small businesses in many different ways. I would take an existing definition and just copy it. Okay. So like maybe the Obamacare mandate, they have it, like, I think it's less than 50 employees. Let's just find some definition and just peg to it so that way we don't have to figure that out. I mean, somebody's already wrestled with this. But the idea there is basically, so one of the interesting things about getting a business degree now is finding out how many things have changed from 30 years ago. So for example, this whole let's go in and we'll cut 20% of a company to save money. They don't teach that anymore because it doesn't work. And by the same token, they're also teaching the fact that if you continue to peg your employees to minimum wage, you will have a higher rate of employee turnover. And in fact, a lot of companies, Costco in particular, have figured this out. And they offer a salary far above minimum wage for this exact reason. And the problem with the other companies that do it is that the minimum wage was supposed to be a living wage, but now it is essentially the peg to which every company who thinks like a 20th century business attaches their wage to, because they cannot legally just give money to employees without being vulnerable to shareholder lawsuits. Unless they make the case that it's going to save them money down the road, which is what Costco is doing. Walmart is starting to dip their toe in the water on that as well. They've raised it to $8 or $9 depending on where you're at. So that they're coming around on that side, but I was trying to figure out, so the reason why you would want to raise minimum wage is because this gets spent out instantly back into the economy. Every dollar that goes up goes right back in. The problem with it is that there is a 30 to 60 day delay between when that money hits the pocketbooks of the people who will spend it and when it gets spent out. And the problem there is, and I got this from talking to friends of mine who own restaurants in particular, restaurants must pay a wage that is either, they got a minimum wage for tip, but they have to make them whole up to minimum wage if they miss. So the reason why you'd want to carve out small businesses is a bar that employs 6 people. It's too risky for them to continue to try to employ somebody after a minimum wage hike because they don't know if they're going to be able to hit that, especially given that there's a 30 to 60 day lag time in there. So the idea was, and he was the one who actually gave it to me, was why don't you just carve out small business? He's like, we're not the ones that are keeping the downward pressure on this anyhow. And they said, in fact, if minimum wage was completely exempt, which if people want to do that for small businesses, I'm fine. You tell me. I don't know that we need to, but it's on the table. Would be, they're not the ones holding the wages down. His thing was talking about, small businesses should be able to let people work for them for free. Mm-hmm. Not because that's a good idea, but sometimes people are okay with that. And he's like, we're not holding wages down. If you have a problem with me not paying minimum wage, you go work for Walmart. This is his idea. And he's not saying he wouldn't, he just needs that 30 to 60 day flexibility so that when people come in and they finally have the money to spend, that when he finally gets hit with that, he's in good shape. I mean, and he understands this because in an interesting way, he was against minimum wage until he had a conversation with 2 people that come to his bar all the time. They come in every Friday, they buy 2 beers, they nurse them, they stay there for 4 hours, and then they go. And they're nice people. And he talked to them, and he's like, yeah, why do you guys only buy 2 beers every Friday? And they said, we make minimum wage, this is it. And he said, if you gave them a bump, they could probably buy 3 or 4 beers. So in 30 to 60 days, this works out great for me. He said, but in the meantime, I'd have to lay everybody off. So the idea is that if it turns out that large businesses, and I'm thinking McDonald's in particular, have already advocated for a higher minimum wage, the ones who are the most impacted by it are the small businesses, and they are not the problem that we are trying to solve minimum wage. Let's just opt them out, and then should be good. Because at the end of the day, if a small business 6 months down the road is still paying substantially less than minimum wage, they're probably not going to have an easy time hiring people. So market forces allow that to catch up, and it gives them that lead time to where they can just, so now they're not up against the wall for 60 days trying to figure out where do I get this extra 4% income from.
Now, we've touched on this a little bit, but right to work. Mm-hmm. You have said that at this point you would veto it because there's not enough information out there for you to support it at this point. What information are we missing on this?
Well, so, it's sort of in theory, I think right to work would create jobs in the same way that you could use a bazooka to kill a mosquito. it would work, but there's a very large blast radius out there, and you don't want to remove the ability for people to have salary advocates for them. For example, like nobody's anti-sports agent. Well, but that's kind of the same thing. And the real problem really is it's anti-unions, which I'm not saying unions are good. I have a very dim view of them, having worked for Kroger as a bagger. I actually had a conversation with a friend of mine who actually works for Kroger's union, and I said, good news, I do not like your union. I will not pass right to work, because I can't prove that it's an efficient way to do it. Our unemployment is lower than 2 right-to-work states north and south of us. And in theory, it does seem to be the case that you would move in to a place where you didn't have to deal with unions all the time. But in practice, it doesn't seem to be one of the primary considerations. Like I mentioned before, job training is paramount. Well, what do unions do? Job training. Like they actually do that in their own industry. So it seems to me to be foolish to remove partial benefit to get a partial other benefit that we can't necessarily prove. But I will say this, some unions are monopolies and they don't function well. And I'm not a big fan of it, but it seems like a blanket carte blanche rule is not the way to solve this problem. If I get through the other 100 things that I'd like to do that would create jobs and then reach right to work, I'll probably take a look at it, but I got a big list and I'm pretty sure I'm not getting through it in 4 years.
But even right now, not every company has to be unionized.
Right.
It's not everybody is unionized. And this would just allow a worker. So if I didn't want to be a member of the union at Kroger, I could choose not to
be.
be.
Believe me, when I was 16, I was like, what? Are you kidding me? And it dragged me down below minimum wage, as it turns out. So I totally understand this. My problem is that on the specific cases it does work, there are some broader unintended consequences to this legislation that I don't like. But I'm willing to have a conversation about it. I mean, if we've got people who are like, oh, okay, we found an implementation that actually seems to work, well, all right, we'll take a look at it. But in the meantime, like in particular, what if, Warren County passes this thing, which they did, and lo and behold, oh, never mind, for whatever reason in Kentucky, we can prove this is effective. Well, all right, then game on. So that's where I'm at on that. I'm not anti it because I'm against the concept. I just don't believe that it is an effective way to accomplish growing jobs.
Okay. So now the biggest financial threat facing the state is the underfunding of our public pension system.
Without a doubt.
Before you even turned in your signatures, you were the first one to release a detailed plan about how to address it. Tell me a little bit about that plan.
Yeah, so here's how I discovered this, because again, so I'm an entrepreneur, not a politician, and I'm like, well, so what are the actual problems, not the ones everybody shouts about. What are the actual problems that are facing us that are, of dire consequence? And I found the unfunded pension liability fairly quick, and I kid you not, I almost quit. I mean, that's how bad that looked to me. I cannot figure out why the other 2 guys have not been able to put forth a plan or even an understanding of the question, because if they get elected, the state goes bankrupt in 2018. I mean, I don't know why you'd want to be, and they get hung on them. It'll be their fault. In my case, I'd like to implement a solution that, I mean, I'm pretty sure it's got a chance that it'll work, but we could always get terribly unlucky. We're currently in the 4th longest bull market in history right now, which means we have a recession on deck. Like, not tomorrow necessarily, although today's not a good stock market day. It's not looking good. But I think we got a couple more years. By 2018 or 2019, though, we're going to get hit by a 3 to 4 to hopefully not higher % hit to state revenues. And the problem is we already don't have enough money to fund the things we have right now. And we are deeply, deeply in debt because the pension system hasn't been funded for the last 12 years. So I dug in and I thought, okay, well, the way I try to solve things is, in a complete vacuum, what is the problem we're trying to solve here? To explain where it came from, there is no other explanation for how we got into this situation other than the legislature didn't fund it for 12 years. It is not the case that pensions are paying out too much money. In the aggregate, it's a large sum, but my father is a retired state worker. He makes $2,000 a month. Had the pension system been a single payer system, a 401k, he would be drawing far more money out of that. So he got hit on the front end and the back end of the system. It hasn't worked for him in any way, shape, or form. There are people that are making too much money off of this thing. In particular, the salary stackers. I would say ex-legislators, if you're in for 2 to 4 years, doesn't matter how long you get a full pension. I don't know of any one of them that's given it back. They created loopholes along the way in the last 15 years to allow people to repeg their private sector salary after public work to be the basis for the salary that the government pension pays out. If I could carve those out, I'll do it. I don't know that we can touch those, but we'll see. I would like to cancel legislator pensions, period, until this problem is solved, because everybody who is in office, governors and legislators for the past 12 years, this is their fault on both sides of the aisle, and they should pay. Now, there's not enough money in there to make it whole, but let's just start with that and see how it goes. So the basic problem is that it's about, I think the last, well actually they have an update today. The last time I looked at it was 21% funded.
Yes.
They lost $300 million last year. And
I think we're headed towards 16% within the next couple of years.
It won't be long, and when they hit 1.5 billion, which I'm projecting by 2018, they have to liquidate the entire fund. It's at least 1/3 in private equity. You cannot liquidate private equity very quickly, and certainly not for more than pennies on the dollar. Mm-hmm. So the minute we hit that thing, that's probably bankruptcy. That's why I say 2018. We, in theory, would be able to ride it out a little bit longer, but that's going to take us out. Mm-hmm. That'll instantly throw the state into a recession because that's $1 billion of spending power lost, mostly to central Kentucky. So instant recession. And then we're in default, and we have the teachers fund, which is bigger, coming right behind it 3 years later. And in fact, like our best solution in that case is let's just hope Illinois goes down first. But we might beat them. And so this bothers me a lot because we've seen what'll happen because Puerto Rico just went through this. They just doubled sales tax and income tax, and they still defaulted. Mm-hmm. That's what we're staring down the gun barrel on, and the fact that these other candidates don't even appear to have even looked at it, just, I don't know, it makes me kind of angry. I'm hoping that's not coming through too much. But so I look at this thing in a vacuum, and I'm like, okay, what is the problem we're trying to solve here? Because I do happen to understand finance a bit. It was the one thing I was accidentally good at when I was going through business school. It surprised me. So the problem you're trying to solve is basically, what's the actual issue? Well, the checks must go out. That's it. Because the minute the checks don't go out, we've defaulted. So it's kind of simple, but it turns out that other solutions that have been proposed have not been trying to solve that specific problem. They've been trying to solve the funding ratio, which is not bad, but the funding ratio is a ratio. It is not effectively a thing. It's an indicator. It's like, we don't need to fund the indicator. We need to just make sure this thing actually can support itself. So that was where the teacher plan was. Get a $5 billion bond, invest it in the stock market. It's a bit risky though because they don't seem to be able to find a interest rate below 5%. Mm-hmm. I find that interesting. I also was not able to locate an interest rate below 5%. But I talked to a friend of mine who runs a hedge fund in New York City, and he said, I don't know why it would be that high. He's like, I don't work in municipalities, he said, but he's like, I can tell you right now that I can buy unlimited Chilean government debt at 5.5%, and that's denominated in pesos, which is important because that means if Chile wanted to, they could just make more money and they're out. So if Chile's at 5.5, he's like, why is Kentucky at 5? You guys can't print money. I'm like, I don't know. So we'll figure that out. But what he did say was, my actual question to him was, could we get the money? And he said, absolutely. He said, if you hung out the shingle on Monday, you'd have it by Friday. Mm-hmm. Because he says there is essentially insatiable demand. And the reason why is because it's hard to invest $1 billion in anything. If you buy $1 billion of stock, you actually run the stock price up as you buy in. If you buy $1 billion in bonds, however, you can buy the whole thing at once and not impact the amount of the value of the thing one way or the other. So that's why they work. The idea was interesting, but you don't want to borrow at 5% and then pray you continue to get a 7.5% return, especially when we have a recession on
debt. And we're already not getting 7.5%.
Yeah, exactly. I think we came in like 2.5 or something.
Exactly.
Yeah, it was pretty low. So the idea was that checks must go out, mm-hmm. getting back to 100% at some point. And then do it in the way that racks up the least amount of debt, and in particular the least amount of interest expense, because interest expense is lost. Mm-hmm. We don't get anything for that. At least if you borrow at 0%, that 100% of that is being used to the thing. That's okay. But any interest is lost, so you want to minimize interest expense. Because according to the RVK 30-year study that they put together, it indicated that there are a couple of scenarios by which we get lucky and we don't need to tap any debt to get. Now, I would not count on that, by the way. That would probably be ridiculous. It's at least 1 sigma outside the standard deviation. That's not a place you want to be if you're counting on returns. So the idea is okay, so how can we do this with the least amount of impact? And if you pull my spreadsheet, you'll find I've got 3 things spec'd out. The first one is we just pay cash. That is not an efficient use of cash. That means that every bit of revenue gain that happens during the next administration is going to that. And in the meantime, we have other things we need to fund. I don't recommend it, but it'll work. It'll be painful, but it'll work. The second one was sort of a riff on the teacher's idea. What if we got $3 to $5 billion in a bond and did what they propose? The problem is the interest expense immediately, because you borrowed the $5 billion now, is so high that it's actually not much better than just paying cash, because you're paying interest on payments you need to make at some point, but not currently. There are people who are in their 20s working for state government who are not going to be drawing from the system for another 40 years. And in fact, that's how it's set up to work, is the people paying in now support the ones that are retiring now. You'd like to get it better funded than that, but that's the idea. So it also is the case that the state is immortal. I mean, we may not be, but if the state collapses, there's bigger problems than paying pensions. I mean, we'll have zombies in the streets and God knows what. So let's just assume that it's immortal, and if it isn't, then nobody cares about pensions. And given that that's the case, if you were immortal, you would actually do personal financing completely differently than you do right now, because you've got a much longer time horizon for that. In fact, if you were going to live to be 200 years, if you saved $10 a week in your 20s and stopped, by the time you hit retirement age at age 200, you would have so much money you wouldn't have any problem funding it, because that's how far out in the future we're talking. The state of Kentucky can finance things this way as well. So the idea was this. It was basically, let's not get a bond, because we don't need it all right now, but let's get a line of credit and then tap as needed, with the goal of fully fund the ARC plus 5 or 10% if possible during good years, because during bad years we're going to be hit up against the wall. But then also making sure that you peg the return of the retirement fund to 4%. Now, the reason why is because the problems you have is you can't guarantee a 7.5% return, right? Well, you can't guarantee 4 either. We missed it this year. Yep. But you could if you used the line of credit and fluctuated it. So 2013, I think it got 12 or 13%, I think. So in a year when you come over 4%, you take everything over and you pay down the line of credit if you've got anything in there. If you don't, you just roll it back into the fund. If you come in under 2.5% this year, you tap the line of credit, bring it up to 4. And that way you use the least amount of money being borrowed because of interest expense, and you get the most impact out of it. And if you get super lucky, you don't have to tap it much, if at all. And you could also apply that to the teacher's fund. And in 30 years, this thing gets back to 100%. Now, there's 2 interesting caveats with this thing. The first thing everybody says is, well, that's debt. I'm like, well, yes, but it exists. So here's my example. Let's say you haven't paid your rent in 12 years, and you owe your landlord $80 billion. And your landlord goes, it's been 12 years since you paid me. You owe me something. Go pay me $5 billion. And you go, okay, well, I'll go see if I can borrow this from the bank. And the bank says, sure, you seem like a good credit risk to me for some reason, so here's $5 billion, and you pay that to your landlord. Well, so before, you owe your landlord $80 billion. After, you owe him 75, and you owe the bank 5. So there's no new debt here. Now, there is new interest expense, but that's why it's important to minimize it, because we are not changing our obligation level. We might change the amount of interest we pay out, and so that's why it kind of matters.
Now, why we're stuck right now in terms of the legislators trying to figure this out is the Republican side, for the most part, wants changes to the systems.
Right.
They want to see where inefficiencies are. They want full audits of what's going on. They want to look under the hood, and they want changes there. And a lot of people on the other side say we need a bond, we need money now, especially the systems themselves say we need money right now. What other changes would you make? Obviously, those changes don't really take effect. That takes a while. We've already done a couple, and we don't see it right now because these people are just starting to work. We passed them 2 years ago, and now they're in a different kind of system. What other kind of changes would you like to see made?
Yeah, so I would definitely like to follow what CalPERS did in California, where they basically got out of hedge funds and just completely into ETFs. And mostly because of management fees. I mean, we probably have played 9-figure sums of money to hedge funds to manage these things, and in reality, hedge funds do not outperform the ETFs. They just don't. And so CalPERS, at the advice of Warren Buffett of all people, yanked all of their fund out of hedge funds and dropped it into ETFs and saved a boatload of money in the process. And it's a great idea. We should totally do it. Banks don't like that. That's too bad. I don't have banks that are buying my opinion, and even if I did, I would tell them it's too bad. So that would be the first thing I would do. The second thing, I think there would be an interesting audit you could drop over at the pension side of things. I don't know what it would turn up, but it's not a bad thing to make sure that people at least know they're accountable. In particular, I know that the pension system is carved out of open records requests. I am pretty certain as an executive order I can put them back in it, and I plan to, because if you guys can't put this stuff out in front of everybody for people to see, you're embarrassed about something, and or worse. So let's just go ahead and throw a little light on this and see how this is going, and then see what's going on. On the benefit side of thing, one interesting thing that I discovered from doing this pro forma is that previous to this, I was of the opinion that 401k plans were not a good solution, the single payer thing. After having run the math on it, they would have wildly outperformed the current system we have, mostly because the legislator would not have been able to rob it. And here's why this is interesting. So in 2001, the system was 150% funded. And in 2003, it was 100% funded. And everybody talks about how the rating started in 2003, but it looks like it was going on earlier than that. And to the point where in my 35 to 40 year projection, you hit 100%. Not long after that, you hit 200, 400, 800, and the problem soon becomes, how do we take the cap off of this thing? Because it just keeps earning money. Compound interest is very powerful. So I went back and I sort of back of the envelope. I didn't actually run this thing, but just theoretically speaking, like how funded should this thing be? Like, if they had made the contribution the ways they said they would the entire time and nobody ever rated it, where would we be sitting? 8,000%, as it turns out, funded level is what we would have. To the point where I believe this was designed to be rated, because every corporation in the 40s also structured their pension system identically, and none of these people were dumb. They knew that they could have structured it as a single payer thing that they could never touch, yet they chose not to. I think they saw this. I think they realized, wow, this is something we could tap every once in a while, like fund transfers, and scoop the money out of here to pay for stuff, and nobody will ever know because they think that they're getting the benefits they were supposed to get all along. So it is the case that if we were 100% funded, I would advocate to flip over to that system, much like Matt Bevin has said, except that apparently he's unaware we only have 15% of the money. The other problem is you can't easily grandfather that in. You can only do it when you're at 100%. Because if you did it now, the people who are coming on board now suddenly are not paying into the system. That bankrupts the pension system faster. It's a great idea. It does work better. We are not in a fiscal condition to do it until we get close to, actually 80% is when you could start taking a look at it. But the way I would structure it is to be like, well, you have the option. Do you want to put it in a single payer? Do you want to keep it defined benefits? The defined benefits plan is actually a great benefit to the state, and it doesn't work out well for the workers. But if you guys want, you guys can pick which one you want. I'm totally open to it. But it's going to be 3 decades before we're even going to be able to make that decision. So theoretically, yeah, you could do single payer, but practically we cannot, and that's the only problem there.
So as the state gets closer to having to pay part of the Medicaid expansion, the issue of the health exchange set up through the Affordable Care Act is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. You've said that you think that it's possible we could pay the 5%, but maybe not the 10%.
Right.
But you're against repeal at this time.
Right.
If we can't pay the 10% down the road, what do we do?
Yeah, so we should know in advance whether or not we can't pay it. And the reason why that matters, and the reason why I'm sort of against repeal, now if we couldn't pay the 5, we'd probably have to be scrambling, but it looks like we've got it. But the 10 though, the problem with that is that if you can't afford the program, you can't have the program, and this is kind of how it works. So the idea was, the reason why I would be reluctant to cancel it to 5, even if long term we're still out, is because jumping from a large, unwieldy, software-driven system to a completely different one is not a costless transaction. It's actually extremely expensive and disruptive, and we just did that. And the reason we need to give the healthcare workers a break for a little bit, like buy them some time, and also then, if we realize, okay, we're going to miss. So, like, here's a hypothetical outcome. Let's say I've totally called this correctly. We hit a recession in 2018, and we stay in a recession in 2019. 2020, now we owe 10%. Probably are not going to be able to pay that, but we're going to know in 2018, 2 years in advance. And in the meantime, there are other states that are experimenting with other versions of this. And so my recommendation is, let's just hang out and wait, and let's see what they come up with. Libertarians are telling me things that Texas is about to do are going to be great. I'm like, as soon as they start doing them, we'll have a look at that, because I'm not opposed to it. If somebody actually does develop a better system, then absolutely we'll jump to it. But we need to wait right now because it's going to be too disruptive.
So do you think that Connect has been working up to this point? I mean, obviously a lot of people's main complaint is that the majority of people are on Medicaid. They're not getting actual health insurance. So do you think that it's working?
For the solution it was supposed to solve, yes, which was let's get people who are not insured. They were not trying to, let's get everybody's premiums down, which clearly didn't happen. I mean, even mine went up. But so it did solve the problem it was supposed to address. Other new ones were created. And so you have to sort of evaluate it based on that. And then the question is, okay, now that the other ones were created, did we get a better deal out of this or not? And in particular, one of the questions was, would this thing be able to fund itself? Would the increase in healthcare spending account for a 5% hit in 2016? And it looks like yes. There was a report that was released a couple weeks ago, says we're more or less on track to hit that. Okay, good. But going forward, if any of these things should change, it's projected that it'll be okay, but projections are great, but I don't get excited until the check clears, so I'm going to be keeping an eye on it, basically, is the thing. And if we can't afford it, we have to do something else. But ideally, make the call as early as possible and be as the least disruptive you can possibly be.
Okay, energy issues.
Yes.
Recently, you came out in favor of the Clean Power Plan.
Correct.
That is not a popular opinion in this state.
Well, not if you're
know.
getting paid from coal companies. Yeah, I noticed everybody who received checks from them was against it. Probably a coincidence.
But in Kentucky in general, people are pretty big fans of coal.
Yeah, you know what though? I mean, I think you saw what happened, but the last week, all the municipalities in Eastern Kentucky passing resolutions saying we want this deal. And more or less the reason why is because, like,
But that's the Power Plus,
yes,
right?
Right, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
but the clean power to cut down on the emissions.
Yeah, but you know what? I'm okay too, because they're polluting for free right now. I mean, if you want to buy that, okay. We might be willing to sell it to you, but that's one of the things I can't figure out about Conway being against mercury emissions. It's like, what, you just want to put the mercury back in the environment? This makes no sense. I mean, it kills people. I don't understand why you'd be against it. I mean, granted, I understand why coal would be against it, but they can make their factories pollute less. They've been doing it for a while. And I realize their backs are up against the wall, and I'm willing to help on that, but dumping mercury in the environment is off the table.
But for the Clean Power Plan, we're going to have to come up with a state compliance plan during the next administration. At this point, people are conflicted about whether or not we should, because the Supreme Court just overturned another EPA rule saying they were out of line.
Right.
Companies
Well, what they did, though, they overturned it based on, they said, well, there's not enough information to decide, provide more information. That's going to happen.
Yeah.
And it'll be back in play after that.
But since companies have already gone through with trying to comply with that, if it goes through all the way and the Supreme Court overturns it, then they're out that money, obviously.
Well, it'll come back though, so they should be fine.
But if that's the case,
Yes.
would you submit a state compliance plan?
So interestingly, if we can get under what the EPA levels are already, and before they jacked them up to I think 30%, because I think it was at 18 we could hit 30, not today. But remember, we also have 15 years to hit this thing.
Yeah.
And there's a number of technological advances coming down the pike that are going to make a huge difference. For example, electric cars are going to be far more widespread. I'm a big fan of Teslas. I don't own one, but I have friends who do, and they're fantastic cars. In Silicon Valley and California and LA, they're on the road. I mean, it's not every 10th car, but they're out there. But if even half of the automobile fleet flips over to these things, then emissions drop significantly. And in the next 15 years, between that and driverless cars taking more cars off the road, I think we probably automatically hit this anyhow. I'm willing to work with coal companies on this, however, but to me, sort of the problem you've got is there is a war on coal. They're not wrong. And you have people who are environmentalists unwilling to budge on a position other than end all coal. I'm not in that position. But you have coal companies that don't want to be regulated at all, and I'm not of that position either. Like, we've got to come to some kind of a middle ground, or at least take a few steps, like build cleaner burning coal plants, burn biomass. You know how to build coal plants that don't pollute as much. Let's just do that. And if there's a thing that can be done, like, do you need a credit facility? Not that I'm willing to lend it, but like, could I help you find somebody on Wall Street potentially willing to finance this? I mean, these people are not, coal companies are smart. They already know where they're going to be in 2016, and it doesn't look good, but they already know because that's how smart they are. They can look into the future and they can see what's going on. So my thing would be is, like, I'm not against coal per se, but you don't get everything, and you don't get it for free. And so, especially when it looks like we might hit the targets anyhow, and especially when they're talking about releasing $1 billion from mine reclamation in Appalachia. I mean, this is exactly the thing we need in Eastern Kentucky. We keep talking about investment out there. It's like, this is exactly what we need. So yeah, absolutely, I'm in favor of it. I'm totally willing to work with them. If there's anything, like, if there's an existential threat that is unnecessary, okay, well, we might try to get rid of that. But dumping mercury in the environment, sorry about your luck. You have to stop doing that.
But like Connect, that was a state decision.
Right.
We decided to do it on our own. So a state compliance plan would allow us to lay out how we want to comply.
Correct.
Rather than being blanket federal.
Yep.
Both of the other candidates have said no for now. Conway says he's going to continue to fight it in the courts, and if it doesn't work out, then yes, a plan possibly. Would you submit a plan?
I think we fit under the federal one already, but I know that there's other places, like it was either the KCEP or somebody was working on their own compliance plan. I'd love to take a look at it. And in fact, I would love to go to the coal companies and say, does this work for you? I mean, this isn't something you want to ram down their throats. I mean, it's not like, we want to shut them all down. I don't. I mean, that's the only thing going on in Eastern Kentucky for now. We want to make sure that they're okay, but in the least damaging, most efficient way. So, I would actually go talk to them and try to get their input on it if we decide we want to do that. But if we already are going to hit the federal plan anyway, well, let's just do that.
But current Energy Secretary Len Peters has said that cap and trade could be part of federal compliance, whereas we could just set up our own.
Right, yeah, exactly.
So you would be in favor of
if that
submitting.
works better for them, I don't necessarily have a problem with it.